And if we have difficulty with all of these rather ambiguous kinds of figurative statements, then we have a great abundance of other statements like, "And he," Jesus, "then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, this may well be why they were terrified and thought they saw a spirit. They had no anticipation that Jesus would rise from the dead. They could not entertain the idea, and yet Jesus spoke to them very plainly and clearly about it on a number of occasions. In the next chapter of Mark, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed in the hands of men. They will kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. That's Mark 9. Mark 10. Again, Jesus is with his disciples, and he says, "The Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him, spit upon him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Now, in case people want to quibble and say, well, Jesus speaks in these verses about the Son of Man. And in case some one of you wants to say, well, now, the expression Son of Man merely means a human being, as in the book of Ezekiel. Let me assure you that the expression Son of Man, like spiritual, has a variety of meanings, not just one or even two. And fairness says that one understand and grapple with the full range of variety of meanings. On one occasion, Jesus says, "No one ascends into heaven but he who descended out of heaven, even the Son of Man." The Son of Man, whoever he is not just a human being. The Son of Man is someone who descended from heaven. That's hardly a man having sex with a woman and she conceives and a child is born. There's something divine going on there. And in John chapter 9, beginning in verse 35, to make it very plain, Jesus speaks to a man who was blind, to whom he had given sight again. And he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man said to him, "Who is he that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said, "He it is that speaks with you." And who was speaking with him? Jesus. So let's not go chasing rabbits and somehow try to set aside the clear statements that Jesus makes where he says the Son of Man will be killed by somehow saying, well, the Son of Man, we don't know who that is. In the Gospels, Jesus uses it as one of the titles for himself. But more than that, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, Jesus says that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now you may want to say, well, you can give your life in diligent service. It doesn't necessarily mean give your life in death. But you go a bit farther and find Jesus as he talks about the beginning of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the communion, whatever you wish to call it. He takes the cup and he said, "This cup is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the remission of sins." Jesus intended to give his life a ransom for many by pouring out his blood. Mr. Deedat talks about the garden and the business of buying swords and placing 8 men at the gate of the garden to guard it. I submit to you that's an assumption. Where does it say he placed them there to guard it? The text does not say that. Someone is reading into the text an idea which they find somehow helpful, trying to assert that no, Jesus had no intention of dying. He had an intention of fighting, of continuing on, and of living. And so we're back finally then from the allegories and the figures of the Old Testament, from the figurative language of Jesus to the plain statements of Jesus that I will be delivered up, I will be crucified, I will be killed, I will rise from the dead on the third day, to the record of that event taking place in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, either that is true or it's not. I agree. It's either crucifixion or it's F-I-C-T-I-O-N. But if it is F-I-C-T-I-O-N, then I would submit to you that somehow God has failed. Now, Mr. Deedat undoubtedly will want to come back and say, well, look at your scriptures. Look at the many different variations. Look at the many different manuscripts. Look at the many different editions, the many different translations. I hope none of you get caught up in that. There are multitudes of translations of the Quran. I could bring the Quran in English by Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall and the Quran by Yusuf Ali in English and point you to certain passages that say different things. But what does that prove? That proves nothing. That proves that the person who translated the Arabic into the English, or the persons who did that, disagreed among themselves as to the proper English words to convey the Arabic. And so for someone to come along and say, aha, here is a version, here is a translation, here is the Revised Standard, here is the King James, and look at the differences. Really, if that proves anything about the Bible, it proves the same thing I would submit to you about the Quran. And so the word of the New Testament is that Jesus died, that Jesus arose from the dead, and that he lives. Such is the message of the apostles found all through the New Testament, affirmed by each and every one of them. Rushing very quickly on, such is the information that comes out of historical sources. The cross, as a symbol, dates back in history almost to the time of Jesus, found among the earliest Christian communities of which we had any record. Baptism, a Christian act, an ordinance, a sacrament, Christians call it different things, but all agree that it somehow is associated with the death and the burial and the resurrection of Christ, as ancient as Christianity. The Lord's Supper, the communion, the Eucharist, whatever one chooses to call it, likewise bearing the symbolism of the Christ who died in his body of flesh, gave his blood, and was raised to life again. The testimony of ancients, oh, you can say, yes, they did not live in the exact days of the disciples. But you find a man like Justin Martyr in his Defense of Christianity, written about AD 150, urging the emperor to check the details of the death of Christ recorded in a document called the Acts of the Roman Governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. You find Tacitus writing in his Roman Annals, early in the first century, discussing the origins of Christianity and speaking of Christ, who was executed by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. You find a man named Thalius writing in about